Thank you so much, Professor Liu, and thanks to the Center for Systems Integration and Sustainability and the Fisheries and Wildlife Department at MSU for hosting this lecture series and for inviting me. I'm very honored and somewhat awed by the responsibility of this, especially at having named it the Rachel Carson Lecture. That almost did me in, but I decided I would try anyway. So please bear with me. I do not have a PowerPoint for you. I hope you can handle it without the PowerPoint. So let me just start off by saying that is there any point to thinking about environmental issues and climate change from the perspective of, quote, the commons, unquote, which is a theme that to many people seems obscure or even out of date? And I expect many students today say, what is that when one mentions it? Although notions of the policy implications of this entity, the commons, has a long history, it regained some scholarly traction way back in 1967, 68, when an article was published in the prestigious journal Science called Tragedy of the Commons. Briefly, the idea is that lacking private property rights, excuse me, over many elements of our natural environments, people are inclined to overuse and abuse them. They have no way to secure the benefits of their actions, nor to protect their interests against others. And so either the strong arm of a governing body or finding ways to create or mimic private property is needed for more sustainable social ecological systems involving common resources. Hence, in the United States, we have laws such as the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Clean Water Act, and we have semi-privatized rights such as programs for tradable sulfur emissions. Now, the commons resonates with more than tragedy, though. As critics of the work of people who propose this idea of tragedies of the commons, myself included, have argued, first, there's no guarantee that either the strong arm of government or privatization will avert damage to vulnerable species and productive ecosystems. The commons is not the only villain and is misrepresentative at all it means, as it has in the Science article, means open access or complete freedom to use common resources. Secondly, against the notion of tragedy is the possibility of other kinds of drama, possible and supported by many historical and contemporary instances, is an interpretation of the commons not as another way of talking about open access and the lack of property rights, which is the misleading metaphor we use, but as a socially constructed institution with certain kinds of property rights, common rights, built upon common interests. That kind of institution has the potential, possibly, for collective action required for sustainable relationships between people and their natural environments. Now, best known is Elinor Ostrom's Nobel Prize-winning work on this, exemplified in her 1990 book, Governing the Commons, although I have to put in a little plug for the 1987 book called The Question of the Commons that Jim Atchison and I published. We might think of comedies of the commons, or at least a wider range of dramas of the commons. So because we now know that communities of farmers, fishers, pastoralists, and others, including urban dwellers, have found ways to maintain communal and local rather than individualized and market-oriented ways of accessing and using the resources available to them. And they have sometimes done so in sustainable and equitable ways. This can be very important to recognize and respect, because this idea of a tragic commons has fueled policies that have forced radical and often costly changes for many peoples who were once reliant in part or in common or in whole on common rights to the environment. Now, today's environmental and existential problems are global. We in the Northeast of North America are have only too much reason to fear what happens to a glacier in Antarctica. Sometimes the term global commons is used for this. The notion of a fully global system for managing the world's commons is aspirational, and it might appear prone to expiration as well as aspiration. A few days ago, I Googled global commons. And the first entry that popped up, that scrolled up for me, read, "The global commons has been discontinued." That took me back. So I checked it out, and it came from an NGO called Pachamama.org that had created a transnational network of sorts concerned about the well-being of the earth. But they had turned instead, they explained online, to more local projects. Well, that's a point worth pondering, and part of the theme of this talk, about fully respecting the small scale when the problem seems so huge and overwhelming, about recognizing and finding ways to support and enable small communities, networks, voluntary associations, NGOs, as well as governments in their efforts to cope, mitigate, adapt, even manage what is happening to our commons. So in this talk, I hope eventually draw your attention to some of this, in particular to local communities and what I call epistemic communities as forms of commons practice and their interactions via co-production of knowledge. But first, let's be serious. It's bad out there for us humans and our planet. Climate disruption, wars, waste and greed and crime, the ubiquity of plastics and the spread of pathogens and misinformation, species extinctions and forced migrations, turns to authoritarianism and heartless populism, on and on. I despair. Maybe you do too. I despair so much, in fact, that I thought of calling Jack and saying, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." So I had to, but I couldn't do that too. I couldn't back out of this because in honor of Rachel Carson, I couldn't back out. So the question for me then was, even though I have despair, how to think and what to do even in despair. And in that regard, for me, I do this by starting by asking, what does understanding the commons offer? And how that might relate to global commons, if that is indeed what we need. So for me, 50 years ago, the commons offered one exciting theoretical answer to the question about why the lands, the waters, the air are so often trashed or polluted, why the silent springs that Rachel Carson wrote about. And this answer, popularized in the Science article, but found in fisheries economics long before and traced even to Aristotle, was that resources, places, things that are available to everyone, that are shared, that are not fenced off, not titled to discrete owners, are vulnerable to misuse and abuse because of the commons dilemma, whereby it simply is rational or logical for resource users to take as much as they wish, despite signs of trouble, because the effects of their actions are shared amongst the larger population, while the immediate benefits are theirs. Their effects are shared amongst others and also the future, while the immediate benefits are theirs. This story often, the power of this story, often told with reference to a common pasture in a medieval English village, was that it was told in a way that generated solutions, either impose the heavy hand of an informed government or privatize rights to the resource so that market forces would exert their force. Commons problems could be thought of as market failure. Well, at the time, 54 years ago to be exact, I was a doctoral student in search of some theory to apply to my anthropological research on the fishing communities of Newfoundland, Canada. And this commons thing, and the tragedy of the commons version of it, was an intriguing and problematic way to explain why the fishing families I came to know were so poor. My first visit was driving on the Trans-Canada Highway across this huge island known as Newfoundland one summer day in 1970. And I heard on CBC radio a Canadian economist make that explanation, observing that contrary to the case in farming, when one must inherit, purchase, or rent land to become involved, people who want to fish can do so freely, as long as they can find a boat and some gear to use. The land, the sea, is free, no rent. And so there are few barriers to people continuing to make a living that way, even when it's not really profitable and there are signs of overfishing. The problem was that privatizing this right to fish is not feasible. Everyone had a free right to fish, it being difficult to carve up moving waters and migratory fish. So it was a matter for government. And the economist I heard on the radio while driving across Newfoundland somewhat satirically suggested that the Newfoundland government buy one-way tickets to the industrialized cities of Canada to get people out of fishing. That was shocking. 3 years later, well into my fieldwork on Fogo Island, Newfoundland, where I'd learned more of the remarkable culture but deep poverty of fishing families, I was out walking along shore one night with a fisherman. And we saw lights on the dark horizon of the Atlantic Ocean. At first, I thought of what I'd heard of old folks' stories of mysterious lights that lure people to die at sea or on the ice. But my friend gently pointed out that such things no longer existed. A Catholic priest once exorcised them from this community. And that what we were looking at were instead the lights of large fishing ships working about 3 miles offshore. I'd learned in the news about large fishing fleets from the Soviet Union, Japan, Portugal, and other places working off these shores. But it wasn't until that moment that I realized how close this was to the lives and the fate of people I'd come to know. Later, I put on my scholarly hat to write my dissertation, and I came to think about how misleading the tragedy of the commons theory was. And let me remark, it may not be a theory as much as it is an image and a metaphor. But in any case, it led to a kind of blaming the victim interpretation of reasons for the poverty of coastal Newfoundlanders. Because it subsequently had become evident that the decline in fishing was not really due to the fact that large numbers of people were involved, probably too many for the amount of fish available. No, the decline in fish was due mainly to massive catches by outsiders, at that time the foreign ships and industrial fish processing ships, and the failures of the existing international institutions to adequately monitor and regulate the fishery. Later in the 1970s, not long after I saw those ships, the long process of coming up with an international law of the sea resulted in a profound change. By 1977, nations could claim 200 nautical miles of exclusive fishing jurisdiction and had the potential of managing their commons. One happy consequence was that in the 1980s, things got better in Newfoundland's fishing villages, and young people went into fishing rather than going off looking for work elsewhere. And more people who had gone off came back home to fish and to work in fish processing plants. And the foreign ships were mostly replaced by Canadian ships in the offshore version of the fishery. Now, moving forward, that was 50 plus years ago. Now we're moving forward to 30 years ago, 32 years ago, 1992. The codfish were again in serious trouble. And this time, the tragedy of the commons story focused on what was now a totally Canadian fishery in the waters of Newfoundland and Labrador. The open access commons story seemed to make more sense now because participation in the nearshore local fisheries had boomed at the same time the Canadian vessels developed an offshore fleet. The government did the previously unimaginable in response to signs of this a virtual disappearance of cod in many places. They closed the fishery in June of 1992. Access to the coastal small boat fishery was no longer open, and when it reopened, as it gradually did over the next 20 years, new restrictions on requirements for licensing meant far fewer people could be involved. In the meantime, 18,000 people had lost work in the fishing industry, and a whole generation was motivated to move into other places, fisheries, and sectors of the economy. And this eventually led to a radical transformation of Newfoundland's fishing communities. Today, as places mainly for the elderly, for tourists, for families coming back to fish in the summertime, and for artists enjoying the aesthetic of abandonment and decay. The 1990s collapse of Newfoundland's great cod fishery, which may never truly recover, is now well known as the example of a classic tragedy of the commons, but it had aspects of blaming the victim and it is tempting to recast it as the tragedy of the commoners, given the effects on so many people whose role in the decline of fish populations was minor. It can also be viewed as a tragedy of commodity, a term that some scholars use, given the role of market processes and business schemes in overwhelming and shaping policy and practice. And even more, it could be viewed as a sorry example of commons thinking as oversimplifying panacea, using the idea of open access as the problem and closing access as the solution for more complex and difficult problems. Now, in a story that I have no time to tell, but is available in the writings of those of us who witnessed these events, it turned out that this drama was a much more complex one. Environmental changes, industry schemes and dynamics, fundamental uncertainties, and scientific hubris and vulnerability to political bias played important roles in what went on. And this means that we have to look more critically at the sociology, political ecology, and culture of the commons. And that's what scholars have been doing for a long time, prompted by how worrisome was the rapid take-up of the idea of the tragedy of the commons, and by its socioeconomic and cultural implications when it infuses policy and practice. And among the best-known results of this critical shift in perspective came from anthropologists and like myself and other social scientists who found in their examination of history and ethnography evidence for community in the commons. Jim Atchison, Fikret Berkish, Eleanor Ostrom, myself are among those who in the 1980s pointed to the existence and role of communities of resource users. As mentioned earlier, communities with the capacity to avert tragedy and at the same time achieve socioeconomic and cultural goals. The political ecology perspective enhances understanding by pointing to the effects of markets and economic systems on how common pool resources are used and managed. And also raises the argument for approaches that community failure, discerning community failure rather than market failure as a major source of problems in commons management is worthwhile to explore. My dissertation research had pointed to the ways that efforts by local fishers to respond to decline in fish by improving processing and marketing, getting more value for what they had, instead were overrun by business and government interests in developing bigger and more effective fishing boats, which worsened the decline in fish. And in the years leading up to the second Newfoundland codfish failure, the 1990s one, inshore coastal fishers collaborated with lawyers to do a study of the problem, contra claims that they blindly continued to fish despite signs of population decline. It's just that their efforts were squashed in a legal case and dismissed by the fisheries managers. And the later efforts by government to rationally manage the fisheries that replaced cod, notably crab and shrimp, privatized the right to fish, resulting in sharp distinctions between rich and poor in the fishing communities. Moreover, creating commodities from fishing rights cut right through community efforts to manage the fisheries, as outsiders were able to buy up the fishing rights a concern that fishers had had from the outset. So moving on to community, the more institutional perspective sees the commons in its historical and social sense as institutions and practices. Thus, it's helpful to set up a triumvirate for environmental governments: state, market, and community, rather than just state and market, as in the neoclassical version of the commons. But what do we mean by community? It's a notoriously vague concept. Elinor Ostrom's famous guidelines or design principles for governing the small-scale commons focused on place-based rural communities dependent on local natural resources. And we often mean something like that, although it could be urban, like a neighborhood trying to access water. In the Newfoundland sites where I've worked, local fishing villages, often with associations like cooperatives, have evolved rules for fair and equitable access to key fishing sites, ways to protect key nursery sites for fish and habitats for crustaceans and shellfish and migratory birds, as examples of communities functioning as commons in commons governance. Community is often intertwined with local businesses, associations, or co-ops that play major roles vis-a-vis the commons. The cooperatives we studied in Baja California South in Mexico actually have been able to control the numbers of boats and gear and set limits on catches of abalone, lobster, and other critical species, and enforce special protections for habitat, and in one case has created its own marine protected area. This provides an opportunity to talk about Ostrom's design principles, because we found that these design principles were evident factors in the success of the fishing cooperatives. By success, I mean their ability to not only sustain abalone catches, albeit set back by major ocean changes and poaching, but increase lobster catches while providing good incomes and social services to members and their families, and in so doing, get certified by the Marine Stewardship Council. Underlying the fishery itself are first two of the so-called design principles for governing the commons, and I'm using a list of 8, classic list of 8. Define clear group boundaries and match the rules governing use of common goods to local needs and conditions. A long-term process of experimentation and negotiation has led to clear boundaries around each cooperative and that are respected by others, and then reasonably match the resource to both the harvesting capacity and enforcement capacity of the co-ops. There are other rules as important in functioning of the cooperatives and ensuring that people who are affected by the rules participate in modifying the rules. And there are general voting assemblies of all members that are periodic and annual. Very democratic system. In creating a system for monitoring the behavior of members and others. In this case, members take turns monitoring the fisheries, including watching out for poachers, and use graduated sanctions for rule violators, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, all is facilitated through co-management arrangements with the state and federal government, fisheries agencies, and help from university researchers, supporting Ostrom's principle about the importance of nested tiers of governance, which are further strengthened by another principle, which is making sure that there is some real autonomy, that the rulemaking rights of community members are respected by outside authorities. So there's a list of these guidelines, and it comes from Ostrom's look at many different cases, and then I applied them in this case to this Mexican situation in Baja California. This kind of community that has capacity for place-based governance is extremely important worldwide. It is where so much of life and often critically important food production takes place, outside of industrialized workplaces. And it is often at the forefront of experiencing the effects of climate change. It is what is meant in the phrase indigenous peoples and local communities, which are often at the front lines of the climate crisis, but often separated from decision-making powers or even dispossessed from their lands and waters. They're getting more attention now because, as has been written in a study of Indigenous management of a Canadian park, supporting place-based government systems provides an avenue to address both biodiversity loss and social injustices, to address them simultaneously. As the Ostroms reminded us, for a lot of public environmental and resource issues, governance involves more than formal government. And in many cases, there's action about using and managing common pool resources, many places and scales and types of expertise. Michael Polanyi's notion of polycentricity. That is a reason to look afield beyond and at the interstices of government, market, and community for instances where people can come together in community-like ways to address challenges to living on this planet. So community can be something beyond, although related to the very local place-based communities. Scaling up and out is a real challenge when we're talking about communities. What if we learn something from these small-scale communities? What good is it beyond that, and how does this reach to some of the more global problems that we have? And this can be really difficult to do because the design principles can translate, but context and history are extremely important, and that's often extremely specific to a particular case. Also, when talking about scale, we often focus mostly on the vertical, up and down, and that is important, high levels and low levels and so forth. But the horizontal is also important. In our Mexican study, the existence of more horizontal connections was evident in the fact that 9 cooperatives have federated, and then they interact with each other within that federation. But also, there are many informal ways that members of these cooperatives visit and exchange ideas, mainly about how to be financially successful as being sustainable, exchange with fishers in other parts of Mexico, and indeed the world, as far as South Africa. Crossing over national boundaries are many exchanges of ideas and assets among small-scale communities, as well as very large ones, such as cities. This is reflects the polycentricity of what is going on in the world. It's not just intergovernmental. You have many other ways in which there are connections. And it's reasonable to interpret these as expansions of community, extending community to larger scale. And this community in the sense of shared interests and ability to work together, even just to share experiences and ideas and support. So we get transnational networks among small-scale communities that can be considered communities of the commons. This has been shown in recent decades in scholarly and United Nations forums that bring together small-scale fishers and indigenous groups from all over the world. They share experiences, they develop consensus about visions and goals, and they also experience community with newfound personal relationships created through shared meals and drinks and field trips, and supported via email, social media, and recurrent meetings. Processes like this process in particular led to the creation of guidelines for the protection and development of small-scale fisheries at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. It was based on that kind of community building, as have been efforts for circumpolar and indigenous rights. Those have been influenced by transnational networks of researchers and practitioners, such as the Too Big to Ignore global partnership of small-scale fisheries research that was built upon pre-existing networks coming out of South India. Anyway, these all have, and many more, have elements of community with some shared history, established and evolving roles, connecting diverse interests and assets, in-person, virtual social relationships lasting over extended periods of time, and coming up with tested and tried ideas for governing local commons as well as establishing global standards. This then leads me to epistemic communities, EPISTEMIC, which refers to knowledge. So these are communities that are formed in the quest of knowledge, of trying to learn about issues of concern. This label came up, was first used to depict the work of scientists from different countries who shared concern about the ecology of the Mediterranean Sea. Epistemic communities often emerge to deal with problems of scientific uncertainty that result in competing conclusions, and hence the need for consensus among scientists to increase the credibility of knowledge when some kind of policy agreement or coordination is at stake. The Independent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, is one striking example, seeking scientific consensus for the political negotiations by the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. There are other examples like the IPBES for the Biodiversity Convention and ICES, many acronym soups, the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea, where scientists from nations involved in the North Atlantic Ocean's fisheries meet periodically to exchange and critically evaluate research results that eventually have a bearing on management decisions. I find similar features in the regional fishery management organizations in the United States, where representatives of states and some federal agencies bring knowledge and deliberate on knowledge to aid management decisions. They are, in addition to the representatives of agencies, are citizens who are appointed to the councils. Anyway, striking to me is how community-like they are. The fisheries management community is fundamentally epistemic, based on the sharing, production, and use of knowledge, ideally scientific knowledge. It is also very social and cultural. There's a history, some amount of which the members know, a well-defined structure of roles and rules, a notion of a future, a culture, a social structure. These are real live communities. You find if you visit their meetings and follow their paper trails, they have shared broad understanding of goals and rules, albeit differences in interpretation and interests. Politics are not absent. Some movement in and out, but quite long tenure, so that even decades later, one sees some of the same people, characters, and similar dynamics. It's sort of like going home for Thanksgiving, going to these meetings. And then there are personal networks and cliques and stories about past events and expectations about the future. All these elements of community that are found. These epistemic communities can be thought of as yet another kind of small in numbers community, like Fogo Island, Newfoundland, but large in scope and scale. Engage in creating knowledge for managing vulnerable environments and natural resources at much different scales. Maybe I'm biased. As an academic, I really do enjoy knowledge-based social life. But it seems to me that epistemic communities are essential to survival in this shaky and vulnerable Anthropocene. As was recently pointed out, strong independent epistemic communities and transnational science networks can foster deeper understanding of an issue while also providing a bulwark against manipulation by one state or interest group. If and where this is so, they are critical social institutions to deal with problems facing our socio-ecological systems. Which leads me now to the topic of co-production of knowledge, which is a fairly new term for more inclusive, participatory, cooperative research. The fisheries version of epistemic community, as I've experienced it, has elements of both co-management and co-production of knowledge, multi-stakeholder advisory groups, research done in collaboration with the fishing industry, etc., etc. The knowledge experts are not all trained in scientific methods and versed in the tools of scientific research. Some bring the knowledge of experience, practice, and tradition. Co-production of knowledge occurs or should occur at all levels or scales. It captures, I think, the essence of the true commons, the sense that we all hold rights to the earth and its wealth, common rights, and the responsibilities that entails. And the very real notion, I've called it the comedy of the commons, of a group of people engaged in figuring out what is happening and what needs to be done for the benefit of all. What is newish is that co-production of knowledge involves a broader and more inclusive definition of epistemic or knowledge creating expertise. While respecting the need for the high standards of scientific process, its integrity against the winds of politics, and respecting the skills and tools that science provides of measurement and assessment, co-production, bringing others involved, can broaden the range of science to economic, social, and policy arenas, and it becomes multidisciplinary. But today, inclusion means more than that, including the possibility of meaningful integration of non-scientists who bring the expertise of having lived in particular places, having worked in particular occupations, and even possessing traditional knowledge. Moreover, issues of equity and justice have raised demand for participation on the part of underserved and vulnerable populations and communities. So co-production of knowledge is now kind of revved up to have to deal with questions of equity and justice, as well as science. The central justification from the perspective of the science and policy community is that engagement of lay experts and practitioners can bring much needed expertise and information to the task of coming up with science-based, usable knowledge, especially where data of certain phenomena and at smaller scales are scarce. It has real extraction value. But for many would-be partners in knowledge co-production, a growing expectation is that the research process needs to be highly equitable. The non-science partners having a say in everything from the research question itself to the interpretation and use of the results. For example, for the circumpolar peoples of the Arctic, there is or should be no knowledge co-production, according to the people involved in this, that does not have equity first and foremost. This has become important to North American indigenous groups more generally. For extraction can be read as exploitation, a settler colonial process. Something other than extraction is required for knowledge co-production to be equitable. More equitable co-production of environmental, climate change, health, and other knowledge is very much a matter of community building, learning and finding ways to accommodate different epistemologies and ontologies, equitably sharing tasks and equipment, coming to terms with differences in interpretation, reaching agreement on what is fair, equitable, and just, including the benefits of the project, respecting and bridging boundaries. Knowledge co-production of the kind that elevates equity and justice bespeaks yet another kind of commons community. Patently epistemic occurs to me as something like a Unitarian church congregation determined to respect all different perspectives and ideas and resistance to dogma, eager to learn. The big picture, though, is one we need to return to. So today, the vast, sometimes global reach of the socio-ecological systems we depend on, not to mention the crises many of them face, makes it challenging to use this idea of the commons in any meaningful way because it's open to multiple interpretations in politics. Scaling up and out can be difficult, even though some of the design principles can translate. The ideology and narrative of the commons can motivate private and collective action, and that's important. But for that and so much more, context and histories matter. So we're now forced to reckon with the reality that the climate of the earth is rapidly changing, and the wisdom and tradition of efforts to deal equitably and sustainably with common pool resources should be among the tools we have to do our best. So let's leap to the large scale. Regardless of what Google initially told me, that the global commons had expired, I should have been recommended by Google that we do have official global commons, areas beyond national jurisdiction, to which all nations share and are somewhat managed as such. These are the seabed, Antarctica, outer space, and the atmosphere. And as of September 2023, a few months ago, an international agreement was finally reached on yet another biodiversity of the world's oceans beyond national jurisdiction. These are all sometimes called the common heritage of mankind, following a 1967 talk by the ambassador of Malta, who was then referring to the seabed. But it's the idea that all people have collective interests, that they be protected and governed effectively for the collective good, the essence of the commons. These global commons are the subject of innovative and complex international and binational arrangements that regulate resource access and use and move toward environmental protection, but as well as geopolitical interests. The problem is, according to a brand new Proceedings of the National Academy of Science article by Johan Rockström and others, that these global commons institutions are designed for an Earth system that no longer exists. The post-Holocene planet is one where climate and other dimensions of the planet, the planetary boundaries, as some say, are perilously close to tipping over into unpredictable, transformative, and catastrophic events and processes that threaten the survival of us and others. Hence the despair that I brought to this task and that some of you must share. But they argue the commons as management tool can come to the rescue as long as we imagine and construct it differently. They call for a more expansive system of commons governance than the global commons I just listed, focused on protecting that which functions to enhance Earth system stability and resilience, regardless of where it is found, because it is essential to sustain all life on this planet. And they suggest it be called the planetary commons. I ask you to look at their article in PNAS for more information on how this planetary commons can be designed. But in its design, they do use concepts that are developed by the Ostroms and others for smaller scale commons, including the importance of nested governance and polycentricity. Now, thinking big is brave and wonderful. But there's also room for returning to the smaller and the small, certainly via the notions of nested governance and polycentricity. Room for keeping focus on local places and communities where people live and what they care about and might have some say about. The small scale can be telling. And we need to know more about how global forces and change affect them, their adaptations and adjustments, and the cumulative and infectious processes that can lead to regional and larger transformations. And in any case, the local is often missed in the monitoring and research processes of science-based agencies and researchers, which enhances the value of co-production of knowledge with local experts. However, thinking back to the article in PNAS on planetary commons, the design principles approach to small-scale governance is, like the global commons, another instance of one that assumes relative stability or at least predictable system dynamics in the natural and social world, and thus may be inadequate today. The challenge is to find ways to deal with more unpredictable, dangerous, and diminished environments. Resilience and creativity, the ability and willingness to take risks in the face of major environmental changes, so evident, by the way, in the Mexican fishing cooperatives, are more important than ever. Efforts at more equitable and inclusive systems for knowledge production and decision-making have yet to show their worth in this regard. But hopes are high that not only social justice will be served. One sign of advance is that a partnership of two NGOs, the Nature Conservancy and Wildlife Conservation Society, have supported planning for a global network on co-production of knowledge for the resilience of fisheries in the face of climate change. Now I'm going to turn to beyond the commons and end this talk. At the outset, I confess to the despair that I do feel about the future of our world. I'm glad that people are working so hard to come up with global and planetary commons that make a difference and participate in epistemic communities and co-production of knowledge in the process. I must confess that I'm very pessimistic about the politics of making a planetary commons happen, but I take some heart in the possibility that there are other ways to think, and that there are other ways to think than tragedies and comedies of the commons. I'm mindful of my colleague Sven Yentoft's recent article in the International Journal of the Commons, to which, by the way, I draw your attention. In the International Journal of the Commons, he advises us to be wary of being stuck on an image or metaphor such as the tragedy of the commons, and to think of other images, metaphors, and theories for environmental governance. The co-production of knowledge, then, could be a great source of alternatives, as yet only dimly revealed to most of us. More engagement of local and indigenous groups in the production of knowledge pertaining to climate change and the environment is beginning to open possibilities. Beginning to open possibilities for what Colombian anthropologist Arturo Escobar, in a new book recently called Pluriverse Transitions, Pluriverse, Pluriverse Transitions. For many indigenous perspectives, the problems we now face lie in relationships, not just between people and within their institutions, but between people and other parts of the planet. Plants, animals, wind, fire, water, and of course the disruptions and losses of these due to the kinds of experiences that the indigenous populations have had. The traumas of disruption and what is often referred to as the products of settler colonialism. But so there are other images of possible coming out of this, other ideas. Deborah McGregor, an Anishinaabe scholar, uses the metaphor of love, and love, which is into which are connections to responsibility, respect, mutuality, reciprocity, generosity, as the basis of relationships between people and some of their common pool resources, if we want to use that term, such as water. And she studied the relationships with water, relationships which have been disrupted and now can be reestablished. And the concept is one of something called a kind of radical relationism, perhaps a radical relationism for pluriverse transitions, if you want to have fancy words. But in any case, the point is coming up with very different images of relationships. There's no room in this for concepts such as common pool resources and common property. No room in this discourse for these, because the relationships between humans and elements of their environments are different. They're not solely ones of extraction and use. Instead, for some of the Ojibwa people, at least, foremost in the ontology, or the way of their view of the world that they bring to research, is the idea of reciprocal obligations between human and other aspects of nature, which also have agency, which also have intention, and that this is for the long-term past and future. Anishinaabe Ojibwa are said to require considering the implications of one's actions across 7 generations, not only for human nations, but also for fish, plant, and wildlife nations. And other cultural models add wind, water, fire, and lightning, indeed, the climate. So I end here. Left with some despair, we are here in the United States in another presidential election year. I find hope here too. Perhaps efforts to cope with our changing world will benefit from the reciprocal learning and mutual respect required to work with the different epistemologies and ontologies. And again, I apologize for the big words. The different epistemologies and ontologies that arise in this process of knowledge co-production, especially when Western science is challenged by indigenous and other perspectives. Perhaps we will all benefit from what a Mi'kmaq elder, Albert Marshall, who was involved in such a co-production process, called two-eyed seeing, TWO-EYED seeing. So my last message is, the more eyes, the better. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much, Professor McCay, and for your really fantastic talk and really stimulating and insightful. Now it's time for questions. Again, the audience is welcome to post questions in the Q&A box, but there are already several questions in the Q&A box. Professor McCay, can you maybe address those questions?
I see a question about, don't the commons belong to more than just humans? And yes, I think that is the indigenous way of reshaping and rethinking this question. The call for the new planetary commons, yes. Yes, that's a good question. What questions about those of us who share this perspective of the importance of the small scale and the local, what questions should be posed to advocates of the planetary commons? And that's an excellent question and a really big one. I think it's kind of lost in the way that at this point, in the way that the planetary commons is being conceptualized, but it's embedded in the notions that we're really talking about polycentric and nested governments kinds of things. In other words, there is room for the more place-based in this, but their focus, at least the way that I read the article, and I only read it really quickly. This just popped up yesterday in my email. The focus then is there is a huge challenge of actually constructing something that is all encompassing. That's a huge challenge, and as I still think of it as almost solely aspirational. And I see a question here or comment about the idea of telecoupled transnational networks and co-production, and it's helping with climate change. And does the framework help overcome panacea bias in the climate discourse? I'm not sure we can overcome panacea bias, because we're all looking for panaceas. I mean, we sort of, I mean, I hate to say it, all of a sudden Garrett Hardin's lifeboat thing popped up in my mind, and I've tried to get that out of my mind. But anyway, I'm thinking that we're grasping for whatever we can find when we're thrown out into the sea. And sometimes the panaceas are very, very attractive. I think that so I think that's a really good question, and I think that yes, telecoupled networks and co-production do make a big difference, because that's one of the ways that many people can participate and that could not participate before. not having travel expense money and so on and so forth. So at that level, yes, of course. Whether or not what is lost in telecoupling is another question. What is lost in having talks like this, where we're not really seeing each other in person? Yes, humanity is being transformed, of course, in these processes, and whether it's a good thing or bad thing is, I'm not sure. I can't answer, and I won't even speculate. I'm asked to make available the text that I mentioned throughout the talk, and I would certainly be happy to do that by when I put together bibliography that to these comments. I do have to stress that I've ignored a huge body of literature, and at the high level of the global commons, there's a tremendous amount of thinking that's gone into that. And if you look at the new article on planetary commons, you'll see an extremely rich literature that's listed right there. And then then if you go to the international journals of the commons, you will find another tremendous body of literature and thinking and creativity in all regards. So what I'm doing here is just kind of going back over my own brain, and I haven't done the kind of research that a student would do at this point in time, and really look systematically at what's available that allows one to think about and assess what makes sense in this really difficult time. Another question posed was had to do with the fact that Hard was actually talking about population and reproduction, and when he used the commons thing, and actually his main source was William Lloyd, who was talking about the same thing back in the early 19th century, and that was the question: why do people have so many children when that doesn't make sense? And my only comment is that, yeah, this is still a kind of classic commons question, and we have but and the emphasis on individual rights is one where people just are not, versus what's happened when we have rapid population growth. So it is a classic commons dilemma. There's no question about it. And let's see. And I do tell the others that if you want, there's the citation to the planetary commons paper is offered in the question and answer series. How can scientists, somebody else asks, relinquish more of the power they wield beyond knowledge co-production with indigenous peoples? Do they still deserve a 50% stake in a world where many countries are supporting genocide in Palestine? Well, that's a really loaded question, many different levels. But I have to say that one of the things that's really interesting now about is the knowledge co-production with indigenous peoples is that scientists engaged in this are rethinking and challenged to change so much. It's a tremendous well, it is a tremendous challenge for scientists, and this is something that we haven't really focused enough on, and that is how can a scientist continue without becoming really introspective about what she brings to her science, the kinds of assumptions, the worldview, and so forth. And that's required if you're going to have a genuine co-production process with people who are coming from a very different a different cultural perspective. So it's not for the timid to become involved in co-production, as those of us who've been involved in any kind of co-process know. You can come out of it quite bruised and battered, but hopefully transformed. So there's some wonderful questions here, but I think I've used up so much of your time that I would like to stop here. But I appreciate the comments and the questions very, very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, this is really great, and this is I think really inspiring, and will inspire us to think of those hugely important issues. And also thanks to the audience for really active participation in this lecture. Unfortunately, we already over time, so we have to stop here. So goodbye, everyone, and really appreciate your time. And thanks to Professor McCay again for this fantastic talk. And so thank you, everybody, and have a good, nice day and or the evening, depending on where you are. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.